The night was always quiet in the ICU, a strange kind of silence that made the air feel heavier than it should. Emma, the night shift nurse, had gotten used to it after working here for years. The low hum of machines, the soft beep of the heart monitors, and the occasional cough or groan from patients were the only sounds she expected. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange stillness in the air, almost as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Emma shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. She'd been told countless times that the mind played tricks on you in the dead of night, that the isolation could make you feel things that weren't there. Still, there was something about tonight that made her uneasy, and as the clock ticked past midnight, she felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. It started with the whispering. At first, Emma thought it was just the old pipes groaning or the wind blowing through the vents. She was used to the strange sounds of the hospital at night, but this was different. The whispers were faint, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to come from the corner of the ICU, just beyond the rows of empty beds. She glanced over, but everything seemed normal. No patients were awake, and the machines were all running smoothly. Still, the whispers continued, a soft murmur that filled the room and made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She told herself it was nothing, just the stress of the long shift playing with her mind. But then the lights flickered, a sudden blink that made her jump. She glanced up at the ceiling, but there was no reason for it. The power was fine, yet the flickering continued, adding to the growing sense of unease that was creeping over her. As the night dragged on, things only got stranger. The machines, usually so reliable, started malfunctioning. The heart rate monitor on one of the beds began to beep erratically, its rhythm irregular and frantic. Emma rushed over, but the patient, an elderly woman in a coma, showed no signs of distress. The machine was malfunctioning, but it didn't make sense. She turned to leave, and that was when she noticed the figure in the doorway. At first, she thought it was one of the doctors or another nurse, but the figure just stood there, motionless, staring at her. When Emma blinked, it was gone. A chill ran through her as she realized she hadn't imagined it. There had been someone standing there. She quickly turned back to the patient, trying to focus on her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. A few hours later, a new patient arrived. He was wheeled in on a stretcher, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unfocused. He was muttering to himself, words that didn't make sense at first. Emma tried to calm him, but he only grew more agitated. "I was here before," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I was here when it all started. I was the one who died." Emma paused, a feeling of dread creeping over her. She had heard this before. Sometimes, patients would talk in their sleep, but this was different. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw something dark in them, something that made her blood run cold. "I am Dr. Harris," he continued, his voice barely audible. "I died here, 30 years ago. You need to leave. They're all here. They'll take you too." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Harris. She knew the name. He had been one of the leading doctors in the ICU years ago, but he had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a heart attack. Others whispered that he had been involved in something much darker. But why was this man claiming to be him? And why did it feel so real? She tried to calm the patient, telling him it was just confusion from being sick, but his eyes never left hers, and the whispering grew louder. The voices, which had been soft at first, were now clearer, more distinct. Emma could hear them speaking in hushed tones, as if they were gossiping about her, discussing what they would do to her. "She's here," one voice whispered. "She's the next one," another voice responded. She's already marked. It's too late. Terrified, Emma backed away from the bed. But as she did, she felt a sudden coldness fill the room. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the air. The whispers turned into full conversations now, each voice distinct but overlapping, filling her mind with images of death, darkness, and something far worse. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls like they were alive. She turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The lights flickered once again, and for a moment, everything went dark. When they came back on, Dr. Harris was sitting up in his bed, staring at her with those same dark eyes. "They're all trapped here," he said, his voice low and raspy. "The spirits, they can't leave. They want you to join them." Emma tried to move, but her feet felt heavy, as if the floor had turned to quicksand. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all of them calling out to her, begging her to listen, to understand. "They never leave," one voice said. "They're here in this room, in this very bed." Another voice whispered, "You can't escape." Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. The ICU was haunted, not by the occasional ghost, but by the souls of those who had died here, trapped in the very walls of the hospital. Dr. Harris was not the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The spirits had been trapped for years, unable to move on, feeding off the fear of the living, and now, they wanted her. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing thicker, the whispers louder, until they were deafening. Her vision blurred, as she felt the cold, clammy hands of the spirits reaching out to her, pulling her in, dragging her down into the darkness. And as she was swallowed by the shadows, she realized the terrifying truth. She would never leave this place. The ICU was not just a hospital, it was a prison for the souls of the dead, and now she was one of them. The next morning, when the day shift nurse arrived, Emma's bed was empty. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened to her, only the faintest whisper in the air, a voice calling her name, trapped forever in the haunted ICU. In the dim-lit corridors of St. Michael's Hospital, where the hum of fluorescent lights was always present, there was a story that no one wanted to speak about. Nurses and doctors would pass by room 7, their eyes darting quickly away, as if they didn't want to acknowledge something dark lurking just behind the walls. Some things in that hospital were better left unspoken. You get used to the strange noises and the feeling of being watched after a while. Nurse Eliza always used to say she had worked in the operating room for almost 5 years, so nothing really surprised her anymore. But one night, something happened that shook her to the very core, something that even she couldn't dismiss. It all started like any other regular shift. The hospital was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was waiting. But no one ever spoke about it. Eliza was assigned to assist in a routine surgery, a simple appendectomy, or so she thought. The surgeon was Dr. Harris, an experienced man in his 50s, confident in his skill. Everything seemed normal at first. The patient, an elderly man with a history of heart problems, was already under anesthesia. The room smelled sterile, and the beeping machines created a dull background sound. But as the operation began, Eliza felt an odd chill in the air. It was faint at first, just a slight drop in temperature that she could easily ignore. However, the more time passed, the colder it became. Her breath began to form tiny clouds in the air. She glanced over at Dr. Harris, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on the surgery. That was when she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was her name, Eliza. The voice came from behind her, and it was so close she could feel its presence, as though someone was breathing on her neck. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned quickly to see nothing. Just the sterile, cold operating room with its white tiles and surgical instruments glinting in the harsh lights. But then something caught her eye. A shadow, moving just beyond Dr. Harris, flickering like a dark mist. It was almost like it was made of smoke, but solid enough to block the light. Her stomach turned, and she tried to shake it off as her imagination. But when she turned back to the patient, she saw the heart monitor, the flat line. For a brief moment, Eliza was frozen, her eyes locked on the screen. The lines on the heart monitor had gone flat. She turned to Dr. Harris, ready to shout for help, but he seemed entirely oblivious, still going through the motions of the surgery. Then she saw it. The shadow had moved again, this time closer to the operating table. She could feel it, like it was watching her. "Dr. Harris," she shouted, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper, her throat tight with fear. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. Eliza took a step back, the coldness now crawling up her spine. But when she looked at the patient on the table, he was still, completely still. The shadow seemed to coil around him, as if it was feeding off his stillness. "Get out," she screamed, but no sound came out. And then, just like that, the shadow vanished. The room returned to its usual sterile, lifeless quiet, as though nothing had happened. The heart monitor was no longer flat. The patient was alive again. The machine beeped steadily. Eliza's hands were trembling as she tried to call out to Dr. Harris, but her voice was gone. The only thing left was the eerie silence. When the other staff entered, they saw her standing by the table, staring at the monitor. She tried to explain what had happened, the shadow, the voice, but no one believed her. Dr. Harris simply patted her shoulder and told her she was probably exhausted. "Maybe you need a break, Eliza. It's been a long shift." But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that room, something far darker than they realized. The following days were a blur. The patient, who had inexplicably flatlined and then revived, was discharged a week later, without any signs of complications. Eliza tried to put it behind her, chalking it up to stress or some kind of bizarre hallucination. But she couldn't escape the memory of that shadow, the voice calling her name, and the coldness that clung to her long after the surgery. Her thoughts kept drifting back to room 7, the same room where so many surgeries had been performed. It wasn't until a few weeks later that Eliza learned the truth. A colleague, a ward boy named Raj, had overheard a conversation among the senior nurses. He had heard them whisper about an old patient, a man who had died in that very operating room years ago, during a routine surgery. The death was sudden, unexpected, and the cause of it never fully explained. Raj, curious and somewhat troubled by the details, began to dig deeper. After a few days of searching, he found an old file hidden in the back of the hospital's archives. The name on the file matched the patient from that night. But there was something else. The man who had died during surgery, all those years ago, had reportedly been a part of a much darker story. It was said that his death wasn't just a tragic accident. Rumors spread that the man had been involved in something sinister, something that caused his spirit to remain trapped in the hospital, restless and angry. Eliza's blood ran cold as Raj continued to share the details. The man's spirit, it was said, never truly left the operating room. His spirit, fueled by unfinished business and anger, had attached itself to the room, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter. Eliza began to connect the dots. The shadow she saw wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was the restless spirit of the patient who had died, the voice that whispered her name, the coldness in the air. It was all part of the haunting that had plagued that room for years. She wasn't the first to witness it, and she wouldn't be the last. But there was one chilling thing that still haunted her. The patient from that night, the one who had flatlined and then mysteriously revived, had never come back to the hospital for follow-up care. No one had seen him since he left, and Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he had never truly left the operating room either. Every time she passed by room 7, the shadow seemed to follow her. She would glance up, just for a split second, and see it standing there in the corner of her eye, watching, waiting. Some say hospitals are places of healing, but the truth is, they are also places of waiting, waiting for things to come and go, waiting for souls to leave or stay. Raj, the ward boy, had learned this truth through years of working in the quietest, darkest corners of the hospital. It was a truth that clung to the walls, seeped into the floors, and hung in the stale air that filled the long, dimly lit hallways. Raj had worked at the hospital for over 5 years, and in that time, he had witnessed things no one else would believe, things that couldn't be explained by medical science or logic. There were rooms where the air felt too heavy, too thick with secrets that refused to be forgotten. And room 312 was one of those places. That was where Priya, the new nurse, was assigned. Her first patient in that room was Mr. Verma, an elderly man who had been in critical condition for weeks. There was something strange about him, something that made Priya feel uneasy. Despite his worsening condition, Mr. Verma remained eerily calm. His eyes, though tired and frail, never seemed to show fear. Instead, they always looked at her with a strange plea, as if he knew something she didn't. He often insisted on being discharged. "Please let me go," he would whisper in a soft, fragile voice. "It's time, I have to leave." Priya, still unfamiliar with the hospital's long-standing rumors, dismissed his insistence as delirium. After all, he was very ill, and delirium was common in patients in such critical states. But as the days passed, she began to notice a pattern, a growing obsession with being released. "You don't understand," he would say, his voice filled with an urgency that made her shiver. "I need to go. I can't stay any longer." Priya tried to reassure him, reminding him of his condition and the need for medical attention, but he only nodded, as if resigned to the fact that no one would help him. One night, when Priya came on shift, she found Mr. Verma looking even worse. His skin had turned an unnatural shade of pale, and his breathing was so shallow that she could barely hear it. His eyes were wide open, but they had no life in them. There was something unsettling about the way he lay there, so still and quiet. Priya checked his vitals, but the readings were bizarre. His pulse was weak, almost non-existent, and his body temperature was unnaturally cold, far colder than any living person should be. But despite all of this, there was still a faint, almost imperceptible pulse. Confused and uneasy, Priya stepped back from the bed. Could he still be alive? Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Mr. Verma's hand, which had been resting motionless on the bed, was now hanging over the side, fingers outstretched toward the floor. It was an unnatural position, as if it was reaching for something or someone. Priya felt a wave of unease wash over her, and her heart began to pound in her chest. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just the way he was lying, but something inside her told her to move closer. "Mr. Verma," she called softly, but there was no response. His eyes remained fixed, empty, staring at the ceiling, and his face was as pale as death itself. But then she saw it, the faintest twitch of his hand. Priya froze. The fingers moved, slowly, as if they were grasping for something. Her mind screamed in disbelief. Was this real? She took a hesitant step closer, feeling the air grow colder with each movement. "Mr. Verma?" she asked again, her voice trembling, but there was still no answer. The hand stretched farther, farther toward her. Panic surged within her. This couldn't be happening. She had seen him die just a few hours earlier. She remembered the doctor's confirmation, the flat line of his heart rate, the coldness of his skin. He had been gone. Yet, there he was, his hand reaching toward her, as if beckoning her closer. And then it happened. The cold, clammy grip of Mr. Verma's hand closed around her wrist. Priya gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened with an unnatural strength. It felt like ice, like death itself was gripping her, holding her in place. "Mr. Verma," she whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What do you want from me?" His lips parted slowly, the words escaping in a barely audible rasp. "I'm waiting," he whispered. "I've been waiting for someone to help me leave, to help me cross over." Priya's blood ran cold as she stared down at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man she had seen die was speaking to her, pleading for help. "Help me," he repeated, his voice filled with an otherworldly desperation. "I can't leave until someone helps me. I'm trapped." Her mind spun, her thoughts racing. How could he still be here? How could he still be alive? He had been dead. He had to be. And yet, the grip on her wrist was real, cold and suffocating. Terror flooded her senses, and instinct took over. She yanked her wrist free from his grasp, stumbling backward toward the door. But as she reached for the doorknob, Mr. Verma's voice echoed through the room once more, louder and more desperate. "No one leaves here. Not until they help me. Not until they help me cross over." Priya's heart hammered in her chest as she slammed the door shut behind her and ran down the hallway, her breath ragged and shallow.
He knew then, with every fiber of her being, that the hospital was more than just a place for the living.
It was a place where souls lingered, waiting for something, someone to help them leave. From that night on, Priya could never walk the hospital halls without feeling a sense of dread. Every night, she would check on her patients, but her eyes would linger just a little too long, scanning the room for any signs that someone, somewhere, was still waiting to cross over. And every time she walked past room 312, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Verma was still there, still waiting, forever. There are things in this world that we try to forget, things that hide in the deepest corners of our minds, things that we never speak of. Nurse Nadia knew all too well that hospitals, despite being places of healing, often carried the weight of dark secrets. One cold evening, while walking through the empty corridors, she overheard an elderly ward boy muttering to himself, his voice filled with dread. "Never go near room 7, child," he had whispered, looking over his shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. His words, cryptic and unsettling, echoed in her mind long after he disappeared into the depths of the hospital. Room 7 had always been off-limits to the staff, an old storage room now repurposed for patients when the ward became overcrowded. But what had once been a forgotten space was now a terrifying legend, and Nurse Nadia, eager to prove her bravery, pushed the ward boy's warning aside, dismissing it as nothing more than an old man's superstition. The first few days after the new patient was moved into room 7 seemed like any other. The hospital buzzed with activity, the sounds of footfalls, machines, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights filling the air. The patient, Mr. Stevens, had been in a coma for weeks after a car accident. His prognosis had been grim, but his family refused to let him go. They insisted on transferring him to this particular ward, and, much to the nurse's discomfort, room 7 was the only space left. Nadia thought little of it at first. The hospital was always full of strange, unexplainable things, but soon she would realize that something was not right. The first strange occurrence happened on the third night of Mr. Stevens's stay. Nurse Nadia entered the room for her usual rounds, only to find the man sitting up in bed, staring wide-eyed at the wall. His breath came in shallow, quick bursts, his eyes wide with terror. "They were standing there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw them, at the foot of my bed." Nadia froze, unsure of how to respond. Mr. Stevens had been in a coma for weeks, his body barely holding on to life. How could he have woken up with such clarity? "Who did you see?" she asked gently, trying to reassure him, though she couldn't hide the unease that was slowly creeping up her spine. "Dead people," he muttered, his voice barely audible, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the room. "They looked like they were waiting for something." Nadia chalked it up to a side effect of the coma. The mind, she told herself, can play tricks on a person in such a fragile state. But the next night, when she returned to check on him, things had escalated. The room felt colder than usual, despite the heat being turned up in the hallway. The door creaked open with an unnatural slowness, as though the room itself were reluctant to let her enter. Mr. Stevens lay in his bed, his eyes wide open, but his body was still. It took a moment before Nadia realized that his hands were clutching the bedsheet with such force that his knuckles had turned white. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest, but the silence in the room felt oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on her. "Mr. Stevens," she called softly, but he did not respond. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but before her fingers made contact, his eyes snapped to hers, locking onto her with a terrifying intensity. "They're still here," he hissed, his voice low and guttural, unlike anything she had heard from him before. Nadia took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. His words were like a warning, a message she couldn't quite understand. Something was wrong, something was terribly wrong. The air in the room had grown thick, oppressive, almost suffocating, and then the whispers began. They were faint at first, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves, but as Nadia turned her head, she realized they were not coming from the hallway. They were coming from within the room. The temperature in the room dropped, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw shadows move at the corners of her vision. Her pulse quickened, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Nadia rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. She twisted the handle desperately, panic setting in as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She turned back to Mr. Stevens, who was now sitting upright, staring at the door, with an almost frantic expression. "They're not going to let us leave," he whispered, his voice quivering. "They never let anyone leave." Nadia's heart pounded in her chest as she turned the handle once again, the lock seeming to mock her attempts. With a final helpless shove, the door flew open, but to her horror, the hallway outside was no longer the hospital she knew. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows on the floor. There was no sound, no movement, just the heavy silence of a place that had been abandoned. Nadia's pulse raced as she glanced back to check on Mr. Stevens, but to her shock, he was no longer in his bed. The room was empty, save for the faintest echo of footsteps in the distance, the kind that belonged to someone who had never meant to leave. As she stumbled backward, a sharp, cold gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, trapping her inside. Nadia turned and ran through the darkened hallways, desperately trying to find an exit, but each hallway seemed to loop back on itself. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. She could feel the cold breath of the long-dead patients at her back, their cold fingers reaching for her, their eyes empty and filled with hunger. It wasn't until she reached the nurse's station that she realized the truth. The ward was still full. The other patients, the ones she had seen just hours before, were now nowhere to be found. The staff members, who had been walking the hallways earlier, had disappeared. And then it hit her. Room 7 wasn't just a room for patients, it was a prison, a place where those who never left remained trapped, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander in. And Nadia, despite all her training, had become one of them. The cursed room had claimed yet another victim. As the whispers grew louder, she knew there was no escape. The spirits had claimed her, and she would never leave. Everything in this hospital is haunted, but most people don't realize it. Those words were often muttered by the older ward boy, Mr. Khan. He had worked there for more than 20 years, and his eyes, heavy with the weight of so many secrets, always seemed to carry a quiet fear. At first, I thought it was just the ramblings of someone used to the late-night shifts. I was young, eager, and newly hired as a nurse at the hospital, and I was sure the old man had simply let his imagination run wild. But, as the days passed, I began to realize something wasn't right, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The strange whispers in the hallways, the faint echoes of footsteps when no one was around, and the feeling of being watched. All these things made the air feel thick with an unspoken presence. The rumors started when I first walked through the hospital doors. The staff often talked in hushed tones about a nurse who had died mysteriously years ago. Her name was Nurse Anjali, and no one seemed to agree on how or when she passed away. Some said she had an accident while rushing to deliver emergency supplies. Others said she took her own life after a tragic affair with a patient. But the one thing that everyone seemed to agree on was that she had never really left the hospital. I was new, young, and didn't believe in ghosts or stories, so I brushed it off. But soon, I started to hear things that couldn't be explained. Little things at first, a piece of equipment that would be left on, even though no one had touched it, a chair rocking slightly, as if someone had just gotten up from it. And then, there was the smell. It was faint at first, a fragrance of old perfume that seemed to drift through the corridors. I had asked a few nurses about it, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the smell of cleaning products. But it lingered, and it was never really gone. I began to work the night shift, something I had always feared. The hospital had a strange silence at night, a quiet that was almost too loud. It was during those long, lonely hours that things started to get more unsettling. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker at the edge of my vision. I'd be walking down the hallway, the lights flickering above me, when I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight. I'd turn, heart racing, and find nothing, just the empty corridor, the same sterile walls, the same cold, lifeless rooms. But every time, that feeling would creep back, like someone was there, just behind me, watching. One night, I was working late, cleaning up after my rounds when I heard a sound. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and melodic, calling my name. Nurse, nurse. The voice seemed to come from down the hall, just around the corner. I froze. No one else was supposed to be there. I stepped forward cautiously, my shoes squeaking on the shiny linoleum. I rounded the corner and saw nothing. The corridor was empty, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from everywhere, as if the walls themselves were speaking. My heart began to pound in my chest. I hurried back to the nurse's station, my hands trembling, but there was nothing unusual in the station, nothing out of place. It was the same as always. The next night, the whispers came again, but this time, something was different. As I walked down the hallway, I saw her, a woman in white, standing at the end of the corridor, just staring at me. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loosely around her face. Her white uniform was immaculate, even though the hospital was nothing if not run down. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat, and then, as soon as I blinked, she was gone. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was seeing things, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. There was something in the air, something that made me feel cold all over. The next few days were a blur. I started seeing her more often, always in the corners of my vision. Sometimes she would be at the end of the hall, standing still, her eyes locked on mine. Other times, she would appear behind the nurse's station, or in the elevator as I entered it. Every time I turned to look at her, she would vanish, but the sensation of her presence would linger, gnawing at the back of my mind. The whispers grew louder, too. It was no longer just one voice. It was as if the entire hospital was speaking to me, calling my name, begging me to follow. I began to feel dizzy, disoriented, as though something was pulling me deeper into the hospital's dark, forgotten corners. It was then that I realized something terrifying. I had never seen anyone else speak of Nurse Angeli directly. No one had told me what she looked like, and yet the woman in white resembled exactly how I had imagined Nurse Angeli to look. She had a calm, almost serene expression, but her eyes were hollow, as if she had seen things no one should ever see. That's when the fear settled in, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I had been talking to the ghost of the nurse all along, and worse, I realized she wasn't just haunting the hospital. She was trying to pull me into her endless night. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging me to join her in the darkness. One night, I couldn't take it any longer. I followed the whispers, the sound of footsteps echoing in the empty hallways, until I reached the old storage room. The air was thick with dust, the shelves cluttered with forgotten medical supplies, and there, standing in the corner, was Nurse Angeli. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. She beckoned me closer, her pale hand reaching out. I knew, in that moment, that if I took one more step forward, I would never leave. But I couldn't stop myself. I reached out to her, drawn by an invisible force, and then, as if the walls themselves closed in around me, everything went black. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital bed, my heart racing, the echo of her whispers still ringing in my ears. The nurse who had come to check on me said I had fainted in the hallway, and they had brought me to the emergency room. I tried to tell her what had happened, about Nurse Angeli, about the whispers, but she just looked at me like I was crazy. No one ever spoke about the woman in white again. The whispers stopped, the visions faded, and for a while, I thought I had imagined it all. But there was one thing that still haunted me, the patient in the room across from mine. She had been admitted just before my episode. Her name was Angeli, and when I asked the doctors about her, they all gave me the same strange look. She's been here for years, they said. She's never been discharged. And then I understood. Nurse Angeli wasn't trying to pull me into the darkness. She was trying to save me from becoming like her, a patient trapped in the hospital, never to leave. But I had already crossed the line, and now, the hospital would never let me go.